Hello and welcome to another Tempus debate lecture. Today we're going to be talking about extensions and second half strategy for public forum debate. So you're halfway to the finish line and it's time to go for the final sprint. You're condensing and crystallizing the debate and picking the best offense and defense that you have. So this is really important because you're going to be focusing on strategy, communication, and arguments. I think the second half is really sort of the essence of public forum debate because the first round you're reading your case and your pre-prepared arguments and rebuttal, and you're sort of kind of laying the groundwork, what you know about the topic, the research that you've done. But the second round is when the interaction starts to get really high and you have to know really the nuance of your argument and how the responses that you've made directly apply to your case. And you have to be able to make your case to the judge as to why certain arguments are more valuable than others or why you're winning the round. So when we say strategy, what exactly do we mean? So in the context of a debate round, strategy generally means formulating the key voters or reasons why the judge would vote for you in the summary and the final focus, and make sure that you're focusing on why the judge is going to end up signing their ballot for you. So this comes down to three major things. So this is going to be extending and frontlining your argument. So making the arguments that are winning you the round. So making sure that you have this great case that you worked on. You need to make sure that that gets to your summary and your final focus, and the judge, it's fresh in their mind. So collapsing on arguments, number two. Um, Generally, you're going to have a ton of arguments being made in the round. Maybe your partner dropped like 3 or 4 turns in their case, and you have three contentions in your own case. You're generally not going for more than one contention, or maybe like maybe two. I would see that's very rare. But you're going to be condensing down your arguments and collapsing, picking the ones that are the strongest, where their responses are not as high and they don't have as many ways to interact with them. Those are going to be the ones that it's easiest for you to win. And then finally, weighing voters. So at the end of a round, generally, you'll have some form of offense, some reason why the judge would vote for you. Maybe your contention one is somewhat undercover. And your opponents will hopefully also, for them, generally have some form of offense of their own. Very rarely have you just completely shut out your opponent from the round. Someone's going to have some reason that they think they should be voted for. That's where weighing comes in. So you're going to be wanting to weigh your voters in the round. So why your voter is comparatively better than theirs. So maybe you outweigh on magnitude, scope. I think maybe there's another lecture I think on weighing. If not, maybe it'll be some in this lecture too. But that's going to be really important because it's going to be how you're deciding which voter is the most important. So strategy. Pre-round is a very large aspect of your strategy. I think this is one mistake that a lot of debaters, new and old, or more experienced, make, is that they don't really plan out their strategy ahead of time. They sort of just like write a case, write rebuttals. Maybe they coordinate the rebuttals in the case so that they go well together and they can work in a synchronization with one another. But generally, the more advanced teams are the ones that are planning out their pre-round strategy. So you want to figure out an ideal strategy, and you want to have an idea of what your opponent is running and what you're running. Generally, you'll have a harder time knowing what your opponent's running, but obviously you should know what you're running, and you should have an idea of what arguments that you make are the strongest. Maybe you have a turn that almost comes up in every single round that you want to sort of build your strategy around, or maybe you have an overview that you really like that you think could win you the round. And you want to have contingency plans in case the initial strategy that you were going for doesn't work. So one thing that I've seen some is that people will have sort of like a filler first contention and like a good second contention in the hopes that their opponents will overcover their first contention, as is our human tendency to just go what we first see. And then they can go for their second contention. Well, maybe your opponent doesn't fall for that, and maybe they super cover your second contention, but they kind of drop your first contention, which wasn't really good in the first place. In that case, you would have no contingency plan because basically your good contention is wrecked and your first contention was never good. So you have no way to do anything, right? So you want to make sure that, I would say, A, always make sure that you don't have just a filler. You never want to be wasting time in the speech with filler arguments. But B, you always want to be making sure that you could see an argument as being something that you could win a round off of. And then finally, identify and plan against common stock strategies. So these are the contingents that everyone's running that are most common. You should have responses to these cases, and you should have ways to defeat them. In round strategy. So if your pre-round strategy is not working, you can find this out by, say for example that you were going for this like weighing overview about like developing countries or something. If your opponents are like responding really well to it or something, and they've like responded to your like your overview and stuff like that, if it's not working, hopefully you have some contingency plan. But if you don't have a contingency plan and it's not working, um, you have to look to other arguments and just hope that you have some form of offense in the round. And you also want to identify what your opponent's strategy is. Maybe they have some big overview that they're going for. Maybe their first contention is actually not that good and they know that and they're going for their second contention. If you can like see that ahead of time, or maybe they're asking a lot of questions in cross that hint at them going for a specific contention or like a certain argument that they might make, plan for that. So communication, this the second round of the debate is the where the communication is very key, and you can, I mean that probably comes intuitively, right? Because during case your partner has no reason to need your help. Rebuttal, you might need response ideas from your partner, but you probably have a lot of blocks already written down. Maybe for frontline if you need your partner's help. Um, but summary and final focus, that's these are the two speeches that have to mirror one another and that you need to be thinking the exact same thing that your partner's thinking, but you also want to build upon what your partner has previously stated. So you want to know what they're thinking before they go into their speech. This should not be something where you just don't talk at all. This is super critical that you're making sure that you have a good communication with your partner. Um, so you and your partner need to be on the same page. No, okay, this is really bad. Do not contradict your partner. Sometimes you'll like say something that's like slightly different than what your partner said, or you'll like explain something in a different way. That's fine as long as you like clear it up in the speech, like why it sounds different. But you should never say the exact opposite of what your partner said. That just looks horrible in front of a judge. Um, and this is where you're going to be using the bulk of your prep time, especially before summary, because that's the speech that basically decides what you're going for, what the round will become. So do not be afraid to use your prep time there and save your prep time for that moment. Arguments. So your contentions probably will have multiple impacts and multiple links into them. Like in an ideal scenario, maybe you just have one link, one contention, or one impact that's really long. But either way, you want to choose the ones with the least responses that make the most sense to the judge in the moment. All of that. And you want to think about your pre-round strategy and if it's going to work in the scenario. So you're always going to have to adapt to what is happening in the debate. You can't always go for the same thing. So if you have two contentions, but it's like your first contention is the one you always go for, but they responded to it like very well, you should not go for your first contention, even if it's good. You have to come up with a way to win your second contention. Um, so you want to make sure that you're dropping contentions that you don't think are helping you and being selective. Um, if there is some way that it helps you win the round, you should mention it, but otherwise don't. Sometimes I see like, especially in like, for example, in the Medicare for All topic, a lot of people ran like cases that had like economic impacts in one contention and then like lives and like healthcare impacts in another. And the debate would like go down to one or the other, usually the lives one just because of the nature of the topic. But there would be like a turn or two on the economic contentions, and they like I would see teams in second summary or like final focus or whatever say, oh, and also we have this turn about like higher taxes. So yeah, that too. But it's not impacted, it's not weighed. There's no reason to evaluate in the round. Don't read things just because they're unresponded to. You can't read a response just because no one said anything about it. You also have to impact it out and weigh it. So collapsing in a debate is focusing on the few voters and pieces of offense rather than going on all of them. So if you have a three contention case, for example, you can extend one at the end of the round and implicate it to the judge why it's a key voter. You can also collapse on links if you have like three links into an argument. So the key phrase here is going for one contention. So why collapse? That's a big question that novice debaters have. Don't you get more voters if you extend everything? Well, no, not really. Well, yes, but not in a good way. So you should prefer quality arguments over quantity arguments, because if all 18 of your voters aren't explained at all, then they're ahead of you. And you have to fully extend an argument in some form, because if you don't have enough time, then it's really just there's no point. But secondly, it also makes it easier for the judge, because they have no way of evaluating an argument if you have like 3 or 4 turns and you're trying to explain all of them. You want to make sure that you're extending the link, the impact, the uniqueness, every single part of it, like argument in the summary and the final focus. Just because you've explained an argument before does not mean that you can just like say the name of the argument and hope the judge remembers. So how do you decide what to collapse on? Consider all of these. This is really, really important. You always have to think of all of these factors, because oftentimes people just kind of look at one and they don't actually consider all of them. So what argument or contention has less responses? What argument or contention has responses that you can easily respond to? And which argument are easily implicated or can be explained well? So think about this like a, think about time as a fixed resource that you're trying to get the most out of and fit the most in, while obviously using all of your time, but it's a limited resource, right? So you might, and most people do, think, well, if an argument has no responses, I should go for that first, right? Generally that would be the case, but if your opponent has only one response on an argument that is really good, if it's like comparatively much better than the other argument, and you can respond to it pretty easily, and you understand that argument better, and it's easier to explain, then you should probably go for that one. Generally, you want to like consider all of these factors, because quantity and quality are factors of your opponent's arguments as well that you should consider. And time is like obviously a finite resource that you're trying to exploit. So you want to make sure that you're making the most of it. So what are extensions? An extension is how you carry an argument through the round. So there are 3 parts that are necessary to a great extension. So there's the link, the front line, and the impact. So think of it this way. You're extending your argument. You want to explain how the argument makes sense, what the argument even was. The front line, remember, is when you're responding to an opponent's response. So you want to think of it like you say this, that's your link, and then you remind your opponent or your judge of what their response is, and then you make the response to the response, right? And then finally, the impact. Why is that important? You shouldn't just be making arguments for the sake of making arguments. You want to explain why that's valuable for the judge and why they're voting for you. You can use this as a basic format. So throughout my round, or throughout the round, my partner and I have told you blank, insert the link. My opponent said this response. One thing to keep in mind is you do not want to like make the entire response for your opponent, because A, that wastes time for you, but B, that explains the argument more for the judge, which is never a good thing. You just want to say, oh, remember their blank response where they said that. Or like, you don't even really have to explain what they said. You could just say their response was blank. And then this isn't true because blank, and then you give the front line. And this is important because we outweigh on X weighing mechanism. So finally, extending, or not finally, but extending arguments. So in order for a judge to vote on points that you've made in the round, you have to extend the argument, which means that you have to pull the argument to the second half of the round. Um, so basically, if you can walk into your round before your summary, you should be able to know the gist of your contentions and responses from your rebuttal. So how can you extend? There's really 2 different types of ways. You can extend line by line, and you can like go down the flow and say the card names and like what each one says and like each link, or you can just say like the story of the argument. Like, remember we told you this happens and this is really bad, right? So you can think of it really any way you want. You just want to make sure that you're always explaining your argument. So frontlining, when you extend an argument, you also respond to your opponent's case, or your opponent's responses to your argument. And it's really important, because if you don't frontline, then they're basically, all the things you're saying are pointless because you've just made this argument, but your opponents have already disproven it. So this differs between the first speaking and the second speaking team, because the second speaking team should have already frontlined the responses in their rebuttal, but the first speaking team has to do that in first summary. So you can frontline before you extend, you can frontline after you extend, or you can frontline in between your extension. As long as you're frontlining, you're doing good. But which one do you pick? So number one, you want to make sure there are no holes in the flow. So if an argument is dropped, B, if it interacts well with your opponent's argument. So if your argument is a prerequisite to your opponent's argument, so like very general example, not specific to the topic at all. Like let's say you have some kind of economic argument and their argument is about like climate change or something, you could say, well, you have to have a good economy before you can solve climate change because you have to be able to invest in green technology or whatever. Um, that would be a way your argument interacts with theirs in addition to just being an argument. And third, if you know it very well and are well versed in how to explain it in a compelling way, I think this is one of the really like the big ones, especially after you debate a topic for a while, you'll become sort of like very familiar with an argument and you're going to want to like rely on them. There's a point where that's healthy and where that's sort of becoming too reliant, but I think generally it's good to know your arguments well. And then finally, if the responses your opponents gave are easy to respond to, which we talked about. And then again, this is just more like explanation of like collapsing versus extending. I think one of the important things to realize is that you want to really be picking only one link or contention, and collapsing from your rebuttal usually means extending the responses from your rebuttal that are the best. So you want to think about what your opponent is collapsing on and what you think that they might use. Generally, if you're like the first speaking team, you want to have like one response on each of their contentions or maybe two. Um, and you want to prioritize offense from your rebuttal over defense, because offense means that you can disprove their argument and you can also like get some reason for the judge to vote for you. Weighing. So weighing is basically just telling the judge why they should prefer your voter over your opponent's, and it's one of the major parts of summary and final focus. So if both the pro and the con collapse and extend one voter, the judge has to decide for themselves which is most important, and you can decide for them by saying things like, "Oh, we outweigh on magnitude," or "We outweigh on probability," or "We outweigh on scope." And you'll learn more about those later. But generally, these are just like ways that you'll explain why one contingent is more important than another. Differences in speaking order. So the first speaking team shapes the second half because they're the first ones in the second half. So they narrow down the debate by focusing on what they deem to be the most important, but they also generally have to frontline more because they frontline everything that was just in the rebuttal before them, and they also have to decide. They also have to extend more responses on the opponent's case because they don't yet know what they're going for. Second speaking team doesn't have to frontline as much because it already happened in second rebuttal. You're going to be doing more interaction later, but it's not as like it's not the first time you're frontlining. You're focusing more on offense because you don't have to go on every single one of your opponent's contingents because you've already responded to them. It's more reactive to the first summary, and it's always going to be interactive, and it must interact with everything that they just said. So some tips: you want to take time before second cross because it gives you your partner, gives you and your partner time to talk, and then it gives them a 3 minute period during cross to work on their summary. Um, and then you also want to stay on the same wavelength. You want to make sure that you're both staying on the same page and extending the responses that the other person said, not like your own response. And you don't want to extend different things. Otherwise, you're wasting time and you're not doing anything. Finally, time management. You want to make sure that you have enough time to cover your case, their case, and weigh. And you want to count the responses that need to be frontlined and make sure you're doing good extension drills to like practice that. So lastly, what we have is a extending and collapsing drill. So this is just going to be a quick way you can practice. So this is a really good round from Emory, I think last year. So one thing that you can do if you want to is watch the first half of the round, watch their cases, their rebuttals, what responses they make, front lines, things like that. Then give the summary for the first speaking team. You'll notice a lot of summary is you're generally not making new arguments. These are arguments that you've already made, but you're crystallizing, you're picking the best arguments, you're like explaining why they're important. So try giving summaries for each team or give a final focus. You can jump anywhere in the second half of the round and give that speech. As long as you've looked at everything that's happened before, try giving one of the speeches and see what you would do with it. But that's pretty much it for second half strategy. So good luck in debating this year and thank you for watching.